Hello Internet, welcome to the channel. My name's Frankie and in today's video we are building a habitat for the reticulated giraffe, the plain zebra and the black wildebeest, all in one. As you can see, before I start building my habitat, I've already marked out where it's going to be. And if you would like to see how I calculate how big the area needs to be, just check my last video in which I built a habitat for the African elephants. I explained the full calculations and stuff on how you work out the total area needed for your habitat in that video. I'm now just marking out where I want the habitat to be in general because I don't like the square shape. That is just the minimum surface area that I need for our habitat. So I can make it a bit bigger and I can make it more ovular because I think those kind of shapes are a lot more interesting. So I'm marking that out using the sand tool in the terrain tab, and next I'm going to have this habitat be recessed. What I mean by that is I want it to be sat in the ground. So far most of my habitats have just been built on the ground, which they lay. However, for this one I want it to be slightly below our guests, and that is because the giraffe is such a tall animal that I think it would be kind of cool to have their head be at similar height to where our guests are standing. Also, just looking down into a habitat just introduces a whole new perspective to the zoo. So using the terrain stamp tool, I use the cube shape and just get it to a depth that I'm happy with. Then I'll go over to the flattened foundation tool and cover the entire area, making sure that it's at this level so that I've got this nice ditch for a habitat. Now that the basic footprint of this habitat has been marked out, I need to make some walls because at the moment it's just grass verges which our animals could potentially walk up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a rocky wall, the kind of thing that you do see in zoos. Often they're quite heavily textured in a way that doesn't really look that realistic, but you can tell they're trying to mimic rock. So to do that, I'm going to use the stalactites from the Twilight pack to create a wall. What I'm doing is I'm using the really tall ones, the stalactites number 3, to create the foundation for this wall. Once I've got it to a width that I'm happy with, I can select all of them and then copy and paste them upside down and kind of tilt them a little bit so that it's not just a flat wall, but instead it overhangs a little bit at the top. I'm also going to use the larger stalactites like stalactite number 1 or 2 to add a little bit of variation in terms of shape and size, because otherwise it's going to look way too obvious that it's been copy and pasted. Once I'm happy with the general look of this wall piece, I can copy and paste it around the edge of this habitat, and that will give me our habitat barrier, which I can then run a null barrier through. As I approach the front of the habitat, I know it's time to put the viewing galleries in place, and that is because I want them to actually be inside of the habitat, and therefore the wall is going to need to go underneath it, so I need to know the exact height of the viewing galleries straight away. What I'm going to do is just place a random piece at the height I want it, then I'm going to align it to grid to create a circle. I can then do the same a little bit of a distance away and join the two with one path. I can then have a path from the center of that piece leading to the rest of our zoo. With our path in place, we can continue to place the walls, and you can see me just adjusting the heights ever so slightly to make sure that it fits underneath the path. As there are going to be so many animals in this habitat, and some of them in particular are going to be quite tall, I'm just pinching the habitat house from the elephant enclosure and using that at the rear of this habitat. The habitat house itself is going to be at normal ground level, which means that we need to create a slope so that the animals can get from their habitat house to the rest of their enclosure. It was around this time that over in the elephant habitat we were having our first baby elephant, and it is adorable, so I thought I'd just have to include it in this video because look at how cute he is with his giant ears and his super floppy trunk. Adorable. With the arrival of our animals, it's time to start changing the terrain to meet their terrain distribution needs. Now, these guys have the habitat perfect already, actually, aside from the zebra, I believe, that wanted a lot more short grass. Other than that, the habitat was basically perfect. But where I'd been playing about with the shape of the land and stuff, quite a lot of the ground texture was quite squared off, so I wanted to change that and make sure it looked a bit more organic and blend the different textures into each other a little bit. For this habitat, I'm going to use the pre-made waterfalls for the first time. Now, these are things that come in the aquatic pack, so you're going to need that if you want to use these waterfalls. What I'm going to do is create a kind of cascading waterfall that splits off into two directions right at the bottom. It looks kind of ugly now because they're very rectangular, very man-made looking. But don't worry, later on we're going to mask them with rocks and stuff, and this is going to lead into a beautiful little stream or river running through the centre of the habitat. Now to do that, I'm just going to use the push tool to get us to a depth that I'm happy with. Then I'll use flatten to foundation to make sure that the depth is uniform all the way along the habitat. And unfortunately, the width of the river is also uniform. Now initially I didn't mind, but I decided to come back and use the flatten to foundation tool again, but this time with the surface height to try and cut into it a little bit, just to make the shape a little bit more interesting rather than it being so uniform. Over at the back of the habitat where our wall meets our habitat house, the height of the wall was very obvious that it was kind of in steps, that it's made of individual pieces of wall. So to remedy that, I individually moved some of the pieces on top of the wall just to make the transition from the lowest area to the highest area a bit smoother and look a little less like stairs. Before we move on, I would just like to encourage anyone that isn't subscribed to potentially subscribe to the channel to get these videos appearing in your subscription feed. It is free and it will make me feel ever so slightly less lonely. So thank you, and let's continue the video. To make this habitat house look ever so slightly different to the elephant house, I decided to take the twilight door planks, the 2-meter ones, and create kind of a ladder kind of pattern next to the door. I just wanted it to have a bit more of an interesting thing on the outside of the building because it is very plain, and whilst that works for the elephants, I just wanted it to be a little bit more interesting. It really isn't much work, it is a very simple thing that I'm doing here. Just lining up the planks and then copy and pasting them until I'm happy with the coverage. And I'm only going to do it by the door. I'm not going to go mad and do it around the entire building. It's just for a tiny bit of differentiation between this habitat house and the elephant one. Usually the way that I display our education boards is to have them at an angle on our barrier. However, in this instance, there are going to be 3 animals. That is going to take up a lot of space. So instead, I'm going to create kind of a backing board for these educational screens to go on. So what I'm doing is I'm using 2 poles or rods, whatever you want to call them, to create a kind of frame that I can then use more of the twilight planks, because I love these planks, to kind of bridge the gap and make a backing board for. All I'm going to be doing is using the advanced move tools to get them into the correct position, and then just make sure they're evenly spaced as we go up the poles. I'm even going to go a step further, and to mimic the look of nails being pushed into the ends of these planks in order to fasten them to the poles, I'm going to use the Planet Zoo door hinge and just sink it into the surface a little bit. This is going to look just like nails have been knocked into these planks, fastening it to the posts. Then I can apply the screens over the top of this as we need. I can now place a couple of these up in the viewing gallery, and in the spot where we're not going to be having a education screen, because there are only 3 animals, we don't need 4 screens, I'm going to remove the screen and place a zebra sign, just one of the white ones that you get from the base game. I'm then also going to copy and paste that and move it ever so slightly off center and slightly behind our original zebra as well. I can then change the color of that to create kind of a drop shadow effect to really make that initial zebra stand out. To provide a little bit of shelter on these viewing galleries at either end on the circular areas, I'm going to use the thatch roof pieces from the Africa theme just to create a circular roof that I can then lift up into the air and create some posts for support and make sure that our guests stay dry when it's raining and they want to be looking at our wonderful African animals. Back over at the waterfall, the way that I'm going to mask it is by copy and pasting parts of the wall that we built earlier and then just adjusting the heights a little bit to make sure we blend it in to the surroundings. We want it to kind of match the exterior of this habitat, so by using the walls that is going to look really nice. Now before we move on to our plant life, we have to place our feeders, as they're going to take up a bit of space and they need to be accessible by our keepers. And I'm quite excited to be doing this in this habitat because we get to use the rather unique giraffe feeders. I believe they're called cage feeders, but they're the suspended cages, the ones that are up in the air that only the giraffes actually eat from. So I'm quite excited to be using those. Inside the habitat house, I'm just going to cover the ground in different sized bits of hay. I like the variation, it just makes it look a bit more messy, like the animals have been kicking the hay about and it's just gone everywhere. And just like with the rest of the habitats in the Africa area, we're going to need to place a bunch of heaters. And as usual, I like to place them underground so they can't be seen, because I personally think they look kind of ugly, but they still work when placed underground. Now it's time to start placing the plant life, which is always the best part of any habitat build. Now, for these animals, I was expecting them to have a really low coverage because it's grasslands, it's plains. Like the rest of the animals, they don't really like a lot of coverage. But these guys actually don't mind it too much. It gets up to, I think, around 30% or 25% coverage, which is ideal. So I start with the trees, making sure to kind of get a general shape for the habitat, making sure I know where I want the biggest things in this habitat. Then I move on to creating slightly smaller clusters of rocks. Normally when placing rocks, I'm using very large pieces that take up a large area. And whilst that is fine, I want to have some smaller rocks that look a bit more natural, like they're broken apart and you've got more debris rather than just massive boulders. To do this, I took some of the stalactite pieces and sunk them into the ground, sometimes upside down, sometimes the right way up, and just have the tips poking out above the surface. Now, this is a very expensive way of doing it because the stalactite pieces quickly mount up in terms of money, but you really do get a lovely variation in size rocks. So I would definitely suggest that you do this if you are creating a river or something and want to make the riverbanks look a bit more interesting. Having this variety of rock sizes will really help with that. Thank you so much for having watched this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving it a thumbs up and maybe subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this appearing in your subscription feed. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.